We are so pleased to have you joining us for Curiosity, Not Judgment. Welcome back. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So, we wanted to talk a little bit today about feedback. Whether it is external, you are getting inputs from people that you have solicited their comments, perhaps it's unsolicited feedback, but there's also some other options about feedback coming to you in some unusual ways. So, I thought this was a good topic for us to jump into today.
Yeah, and if we're being good and being curious, we're going to get feedback. I suppose we're always getting feedback. People would say feedback from the universe. We're getting feedback from whenever we do something, we kind of create a feedback loop, and we're going to get feedback from others overtly. We get feedback from, animals and plants. And you don't water a plant for a while, you're going to get feedback. It's going to die, right? And so all the things that we take care of or don't take care of in the world respond and give us feedback, right? And if we're staying curious, then we're actually looking for that feedback and seeing what we should do with it.
It's an interesting word in and of itself. And so when you think about a stage performer, somebody who's got a microphone in front of an audience, and sometimes they'll get too close to the speakers and it makes that screechy, horrible noise, that is feedback, right? There is an audio interference. There is, I don't know the engineering part of it, but something happens to make this horrific noise and everybody winces in pain because it's a really loud, terrible sound. But I think that loud, terrible sound is sometimes in our own heads as we have our own feedback loop happening. And I'm saying that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not really, because we can get in our own heads and cause such noise and such chaos that we are paralyzed from making decisions sometimes. We are paralyzed by the sound of our own voices, not being clear about step up a foot, fall back a foot, go to the left, go to the right. We're stuck, right? And so the screech continues on. And so I find this kind of topic overall about feedback is a really impactful one.
Feedback can be good, it can be bad, it can be critical, it can be constructive, it can be a lot of things we label feedback. I think that there are times in my life, though, where I just feel like I don't want feedback. I just want to do what I want to do, and everybody just leave me alone and let me do my agenda.
Sure.
And I don't want your feedback. It's not really true. I value people's feedback, and I want feedback in the world. Look, if I'm standing too close to a speaker with a microphone in my hand, then that's the natural consequence of that loop. It's like an op amp where it's just feeding on itself, and it creates that terrible screech. But now if I'm curious and I'm willing to adapt and change my old ideas, I'm not going to go stand next to that speaker anymore, right? And so I can adjust properly, and it will generally in life go better for me.
But if for whatever reason, let's say you actually had deafness and you can't hear that, and so you don't know that you need to move, you don't know that you need to reposition, I think that's kind of what we're getting at in the overall description of this. If we are deaf to the feedback of others and we are stuck in a particular position, we may be causing noise and chaos by not being able to respond.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting about that? What level of feedback? Are we intentionally ignoring feedback, like I sometimes do sometimes, or are we just not even able to hear it? I was thinking the other day, I was having a discussion with some of my grandkids who are living with me right now, and what a joy to talk about. I mean, and man, kids have a natural curiosity. It's so much fun. But we started talking about different frequencies of sound, and I said, there's some sounds that dogs can hear that we cannot. The sounds exist, we just can't hear them. That was a freaky thing for them to kind of process. It's like, wait a minute, there's sounds out there that we can't hear, but a dog can hear, right? And if you think about the first time I heard that, I remember being a little bit freaked out by that. It's like, wait a minute, there's stuff that goes on around me that I don't see and I don't know. Isn't that weird, or is that scary? And it's funny because sometimes, okay, so if the person is deaf and they walk next to a speaker and they literally can't hear the feedback, well, then they have to have somebody else, a guide, a navigator, somebody who cares about them to say, hey, could you please step away so that we can hear you, because we want to hear what you have to say. And so I think, being sensitive to your environment and paying attention to what's going on around us is part of being curious, right?
Hmm. Absolutely. And I love that story about talking to the grandkids about the sounds that the dogs can hear that we cannot. But as just aging happens, the progression of aging
Mm.
happens, we lose certain frequencies that we can hear, right? And so
What are you talking about? I'm in denial about this.
well, if you start asking me what a whole lot of times, I'll know that you have now tuned out my voice. But sincerely, there are just certain pitches, certain tones that just the ear, I guess, with degeneration with age, can't hear anymore. And so I think this makes for a really good example of just the intentionality that we have to look for feedback, to choose to seek it out, and to really want to value what people say, though you can't always act on it, whether there's a prohibition with cost or whatever, or if you choose not to act on it. At least if we are maintaining that curious posture and want the feedback, we're at least a good starting place.
We've been talking and we're implying oral feedback so far, but as you were talking, it struck me that there's those micro inequities, the body language, right? That some people just don't get. We saw a movie about somebody who was on the spectrum of autism. It's called The Accountant. Amazing thriller movie, by the way, if you've never seen it. With some good twists. But anyway, he's on the spectrum, and there's a couple of other people in the movie who are on the spectrum, and it's hard for them to pick up on sometimes on the cues that people are expecting them to get by being frustrated or being angry or by being upset about something. And we, I think, can become immune to that. I think we can ignore intentionally and or purposely not be sensitive to, or maybe we're just so overwhelmed that we can't get into the body language. Or if you're addressing a large audience, you can't get the body language of everybody.
Certainly.
Although I do pick out certain people when I'm talking to a large audience, and just kind of, and I don't check out the ones who are smiling and nodding their heads, although those are fun when I need encouragement. I'm looking at the people who are checking out. I'm looking at the people who are disagreeing with me. And I'm constantly looking for that, especially in a small group. If I'm talking with somebody, if I'm looking to make someone aware or help someone understand something, teach somebody something, etc. I'm constantly looking for that feedback to see if they're getting it, right? Are their eyes glazed over? Are they nodding?
Right.
Are they giving me proper oral and body language feedback as we go? So there's many, many different types of feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what do we do with the feedback we receive? I think that's kind of the bulk of the conversation we wanted to have today. So let's maybe start on the negative side.
Okay.
Let's assume you get some really hard feedback from somebody, whether you had asked for it or not. You've been told something about a behavior or a certain element of what you do that they're not pleased with or they don't care for. So what do you do in a curious posture to handle negative feedback?
This is hard for me to say out loud because I'm not great at it, but I want to be great at it. And that is, the first thing you do is acknowledge the person's feedback. Whether you agree with it or not, whether you're going to do anything about it or not, acknowledge that they're heard. I think a lot of people these days don't feel heard.
Right.
And if you can just say, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying here. I'm acknowledging. You don't have to parrot it back to them like we did in the 60s with this reflective
I hear
listening.
you saying this.
Right.
Yeah.
You just say, okay, I get it. You just acknowledge that they're giving you the feedback.
Yeah.
A better, as an added bonus, icing on the cake, make them understand or help them perceive that you actually heard them and what they're trying to say specifically. But then I think it's just as important to set the expectation of, I hear you, I may or may not choose to do something about that. Or I know. Now, what I don't want to do, I know a lot of people take that to the extreme and they go, well, I'm Irish. That's how I am.
Yeah, that's the way it is.
This is the way it is, right? I mean, because that's not true. We can all change or tweak ourselves a little bit. Now, there is the nature versus nurture stuff and things that come out immediately, but we all have the choice to take a pause, take a minute, and then have a response based on our values that is may be different than the way we were brought up or different than our genetics, right? We can do that. But I think it is fair to make the expectation of, I've gotten that feedback before, and I'm either trying to change and have been unsuccessful, or I can tell you that every once in a while it's not going to work just based on data that I have and trying to be self-aware. Or, you know what, I'm not going to change. I like this part of myself, and I'm just going to change. I like myself like this.
Yeah. I had a conversation with somebody recently about some negative things that they had heard. And I'm sure you've heard this adage, and it's probably takes on several different forms, but the idea of treat it like watermelon. Eat the fruit, spit out the seed. Because it's not going to be 100% accurate. It's not going to be a perfect, reflection of you. And so if you receive some negative comments, what is it that you can take in, that you can internalize, that you can do something about? Those items that you cannot, for whatever reason, spit it out as the seed. I guess that's a good analogy only if you have seeded watermelon, which most people don't anymore.
Right.
But, I think it is important to really have that consideration for it hurts, it stings, but what about this is true? What am I not seeing in myself, or what am I not realizing about myself, the way I speak or communicate or act or perform, that is giving this negative feedback? And do I need to do something to alter my behaviors?
Well, let's go into the motivation of the other person. And we can't always know what the motivation. What is the famous saying? I judge myself on my motives, but I judge you on your actions. Right? So sometimes it's not really obvious what the other person's motives are. How many times do we have to tell a child, well, the parent really has your best interest in mind? It doesn't feel that way to the child.
Sure.
Right? I don't know. I can't go to the concert. What does that got to do with having my best interest in mind, right? And so I think that, but as much as possible, if you've got pretty good data that someone's for you, I think we can and should take that feedback as more relevant than someone who clearly dislikes us or has other agendas in mind, or is someone who acts out of fear and other issues that they have in their lives where the feedback is clearly not meant for your benefit.
Right, it's just a sting.
It's just a sting. It's a zinger. It's let me see if I can win this argument. Let me see if I can, get over on you or end this because I don't have anything useful to say. I'm just going to end this with a feedback that's not even necessary or appropriate. And so I think that you can sometimes filter the feedback at first, and you can say, okay, is this someone who's for me? Is this someone who's generally got my best interests in mind or not?
Yeah, I think that's a great first step and a great first question to consider. And so if the presumption is, generally this person and I have gotten along, I felt like we had some good rapport, so the assumption is that individual is for you, and yet they're saying some really hard things. And so then the process begins of, okay, how do I take the content of what's being said and kind of run it through the filter of the way that I perform, the job that I do, etc. And how do I make a determination about course correction?
So your head is always in the sky. You always have a positive outlook. You are always Pollyanna. Those are things that I've heard in my life. And I remember one time saying something back to somebody. It's like, okay, so is that not useful to you? Is that something you want me to change? No, I'm just making the observation again. Sometimes it's frustrating for me because I can't get there. I don't want it there. I actually appreciate it. They said that in a frustrated tone even, right? But sometimes they're okay with it. They're just making a statement of fact. They're just an observation that okay, so they're not expecting you to change. They're just making an observation about you as a person. That's okay. And there's no expectation of change.
Well, so sometimes a follow-up question is going to be necessary. It's like, well, okay, if you've made the statement that I'm always, Pollyanna or head in the sky, head in the clouds, is that a bad thing? Or what do you suggest I do about it, right?
Or not even suggest what I do about it. Is that something that you feel is useful to our relationship or to the situation? And again, some of this is situational also. It's like, okay, we're in the middle of a fire. I don't need you to be optimistic. I need to get out of here.
You need a battle
Right?
plan
Let's
to get
go.
out. Yeah.
And so some of it's situational. And by the way, even if it's somebody who's your friend and who has your best interest, they may be having a bad day and taking something out on you that they cannot or do not feel like they can take out on somebody else. We sometimes take for granted the people that are closest to us, and we lash out at them for reasons. I mean, when you're watching a movie, you can see how someone lashes out at someone. You say, "Oh, don't do that. It's not their fault. You're doing that because you got this over here going on."
You know the backstory.
It's so much easier to watch somebody else, by the way, and say, "Hey, don't do that." But if we look in the mirror, it's like, right, so.
Well, so then let's shift over to the positive side. Do we need to ask curious questions around receiving positive feedback?
I think it's good to say what's working for you in this relationship with a colleague, somebody who works for you, somebody who you work for. Hey, what's working in this relationship for you, and what's not? I think that's fine. Sometimes the what's not or the one that's what's for can be good or bad. People sometimes get in groupthink and they say, "Oh, I love the fact that you always agree with me." Well, that's not necessarily good
Or helpful.
right? Or helpful, right? And so, but I think it's fine to say that in the context of trying to improve the relationship. Why not? I mean, that's a good, curious thing to do when you're asking for it. You talked earlier though about solicited or unsolicited. When someone is saying something to you and you're reading through. I saw the second movie of the Inside Out series this weekend with my grandkids. Inside Out 2, I highly recommend, by the way. And it's so funny for someone like me to watch who didn't even realize they had feelings until a few years ago. But there's one of the characters that's in the head of the main character who's always looking for that body language. Oh, look, her furrowed brow. Oh, she's giving us that look. She knows something. She's not selling us, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're going to follow up on it and not just sit and stew on it, right? What do you do about those 3,000 voices in the head and the cacophony of sounds and noises that they're constantly making? Do you let them stew? Do you act on it? Do you ask, hey, what's going on here? Do you just make assumptions and go with it?
This pulls in so many new thoughts into my head as you ask that question, and especially because we've been talking a little bit about the actual audio process, the sound that you're hearing and interference with microphones and speakers and all that kind of stuff. And I think about when you hear a piece of music, there are times when it just is noise because you cannot draw out a melody. You can't hear the progression of a melody. And so it just becomes noise. And I think very much in that same way, when you have all of the voices in your head, whether it's your own internal processing or it's, noises that are coming from others that are joining with what's already stewing around in your brain, it can become really noisy in there. And to be able to pick out the melody, to pick out the notes, to say, I need to extract this sound so I can hear it and process it, is a really, really difficult thing to do sometimes. And so I am fascinated by kind of the overlapping of worlds of thought and sound and sight and all of these different beautiful ways that we're created as human beings. And it's fascinating to me, but I think it is really important to understand, like, there are just simply times of being overwhelmed. You cannot hear because you've got trauma in your life that you're dealing with. You've got situations that you just simply have to survive. And so receiving feedback at that moment is probably going to be something that just has to wait until later. You just are incapacitated from being able to take action because of the noise in your life. But then there's other times when the craziness of what is in the moment subsides, and then to bring that back up, say, now, what did you tell me last week? I was trying to get my reporting done, but you said something, and just to be intentional to circle back, because there may be times that we need to tune it out because of just the sheer volume. And again, I'm not trying to be too cutesy with this, but there is a volume increase in times of chaos, right? And so when things have calmed down, to circle back and reconsider, what was that feedback that someone was trying to say to me? And now do I have the capacity to process it and move forward with it?
I have a brain that doesn't take multiple inputs well. So, for instance, if I'm watching a movie and some distraction is going on over here, thank God these days I can push pause. Right? In the old days, you're watching live television, you can't push pause.
Right.
And so, and I'm aware of that in myself. It sometimes helps and sometimes doesn't, but it's very difficult for me to do multiple inputs at once. So I do find myself controlling the amount of feedback that I am processing at any given moment. And you mentioned that there, that, you know, sometimes it's loud and you have to wait till a time where it's more quiet to be able to process, but do come back to it. And I think that's the key. Don't just say, well, it's too loud, it's too much for me, and then just go, you know, watch TV all night and then never process it. I think it's important to process things, and that's another thing that I'm learning how to do. I would say that I find myself often, when I've got a lot of inputs and a lot of thoughts in my brain, I will try to go back almost to a foundational situation and say, okay, here's what I know and here's what I'm okay with, and then kind of reset and then let the feedback or the things come to me to process in a way that I can do it in a succinct and orderly manner. And as I say that, is it ever orderly? Is it ever, do I have that luxury all the time? You know, there's sometimes when you're in the middle of something, you just need to act. And you hope that the action is the right action. But having certain filters up and knowing when to listen to what and which voices are active in your head. I tell you what, that little orange anxiety dude in Inside Out 2, man, I related as soon as that one came on the scene. And anxiety doesn't come in until she hits puberty, by the way, in the movie, which I think is appropriate. Before that, there's no anxiety in there, and all of a sudden there's anxiety, and I tell you that anxiety person starts getting worked up and worked up and worked up, and it causes real issues, you know, and even to the point of a panic attack, and you know, and that's those things are real. We can be overwhelmed. We can get sensory overload, and it sounds just like the squeak of standing too close to the speaker.
Yeah.
What do we do in those situations?
Yeah. Seeking quiet and seeking solitude. And I think that's something that we talk about next week, because I think we have touched on it very briefly in the past about providing margin within your day, building in the times of quiet, building in the times of contemplation, and being able to really think through some of the thoughts and process some of those conversations that took place in the middle of noise, and you need that space to be able to really think through them in depth. And so, yeah, interesting way that this went. And yeah, I also saw the Inside Out 2 movie and also recommend it just for the sense of, I think it's fascinating to imagine, as it does in the film, you know, if you had a control panel that was your brain and a bunch of characters that were labeled joy, sadness, envy, anxiety, and they're pushing the buttons in there, you know, what are you letting take dominance, right? What's taking dominance in your head?
Exactly.
And so, yeah, maybe we can touch next week about that intentionality around seeking quiet and seeking time to process and seeking time to make space for the important feedback analysis that needs to take place.
There are some people who claim that taking that space daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annually is a life changer for them. And I think a lot of us just run from crisis to crisis, from cacophony to cacophony, from noise to noise, and we don't take that quiet time to process. And that may lead to more chaos.
Well, so let's jump into it next week. We'll leave you with some curious thoughts around both the noise and the quiet in your own space. And as always, we welcome anything that you want to share with us. So curiositynotjudgment.com is the website, and the YouTube channel is always a great place to leave some messages as well. So until next week, we hope the volume stays low enough for you to get your jobs done, and we'll talk again next time.
Take care.